So our agenda is pretty straightforward for this meeting. We are going to do some welcome and updates from myself, Maggie Anderson with Mayor Stoney's office. And then we'll have our report out from the subgroups, starting with our use of force subgroup. And we'll move to the community engagement and healing subgroup, and then our human services calls for service subgroup will go last. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can see everybody. Happy Friday again, everyone. So I got a couple of updates on my end. Number one, just wanted to remind everybody that might be tuning in, or any of the task force members that may have missed my email. The initial report final combined version that you all put together, that is available on rva.gov under the mayor's office page, or working group page. So you can find that initial report from the task force there. And then as a reminder, the final task force report will be due on November 5th, end of the day on November 5th to us. And it'll essentially follow the same format of your initial report. One piece I wanted to emphasize with everyone is that I know that in conversations I've had with the various subgroups, folks are working on fleshing out some of those initial recommendations a little bit more. One piece that we spoke about a little bit in the human services subgroup this week was really focusing on the goals and the outcomes, the defined outcomes that you want to see from a given recommendation, from your subgroup. And I think that would really help as the administration moves forward with implementation of your initial recommendations. Having those desired outcomes really defined by this task force would be really, really helpful. So, versus having to get, in the next 2.5 weeks, having to flesh out all of the various programmatic details of every single recommendation, I think it would really be the most helpful to have those goals and outcomes really clearly defined by your subgroups to assist with implementation. And then as another reminder for everyone, the co-chairs of each subgroup and of the overall task force are going to be assisting the mayor's office with several listening sessions in each quadrant of the city. We're going to be doing these meetings virtually. Once I have that finalized schedule for, I will share that with the task force members so that they can know when those engagements are taking place. But really we're looking at, structured listening sessions to get feedback on your initial recommendations. So we're still fleshing out those details, but once I have all of that, I will share that with you. And then just as a reminder, as you're working towards that final report, Daryl created a share drive folder on Google for everyone here. So all of those documents, all the working documents that you all have had are on that Google Drive. You should have access to that. If you don't for any reason, please reach out to Daryl or myself so that we can make sure you have that link to that drive. And then with that, does anyone have any questions about any of that information for me? All right, and with that, I will turn it over to the force subgroup to do the report out. And then as always, folks, feel free to jump in. Oh, Cynthia, do you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned the website. Is that available in other languages for people to understand it?
Sam, could you help answer that question if you're on?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, I'm Sam Schwartzkopf. I work in the office of the press secretary to the mayor. I'm part of the website development team. That's a great question, Cynthia. The website is available for translation into many languages, I think 20 plus languages, including Spanish.
Okay, thank you.
Great question, Cynthia. Thank you for that. And thank you, Sam, for your assistance. All right, so Sheba, Courtney, and Natasha, I will turn it over to all of you to do your report out. And as always, everyone feel free to jump in and ask questions or provide feedback.
I guess I'm it. Happy Friday, everybody. Use of Force group has met, twice. We meet weekly. We also, after the initial release of the recommendations to the public, we all participated in a listening session with members from the community. Tough conversations. Like we are working towards some goals that impact the entire city, and we really want to hear from people who will be most impacted. Um, our views aren't the only ones that matter, but what we learned and what we've been discussing in the past 2 weeks is what's most beneficial for the entire city when we're talking about use of force issues. The most important still remains as accountability and transparency. We also have been doing some work in collaboration with this task force around different policies with special session going on and city council, who makes a lot of the decisions around what rules will be followed with use of force. So we discussed the city council not willing to entertain the discussion about banning the use of non-lethal weapons. And what stuck out with us and this Tuesday's meeting was really, really hard. I think Brad, who became our Dr. Pelfrey this week, for being the point person on answering all of our questions around the police side of what it means to take away non-lethal weapons and the alternative to taking away tear gas and what that means for the community. Um, we still have a ton of work to do because the alternative is not the best option for the community. We are addressing so many different things on so many different levels about what is use of force, like what is the idea of using force. And it dawned on me that some people in the community are willing to take the opportunity to become communal policing, to become the alternative to calling on the police for everything, and some people are not. That's just where we have landed this week, and it has become apparently and abundantly clear that if we are seeking change, we have to also seek a resolution. So we're still working through that. Had some really, really tough conversations about where our power lies in this task force and how we're going to proceed with recommendations if they are not met with positive impact. And we've talked about like our different people who make the decisions just being on board with this. But we have to understand that it doesn't just stop with us making the recommendations. It also has to go through chains of command and a process, a time waning process. So we definitely, as we're going into the next couple of weeks, having these future listening sessions, it is imperative that people get involved and speak their truth and tell us like what they feel, because it can't just be the 30 some plus of us who are making these decisions. And I honestly, I love the commitment of everybody in our subgroup who has the hard conversations and shares like difficult things that are happening that aren't being documented on paper. So a lot of our recommendations centered around people who are not always coming forward making complaints, but necessarily and most importantly, what do we do to give them the option to make the reports, also feel safe, and continue to be able to live in community. So that has been a big thing that we're kind of working through. Um, the Commonwealth Attorney's Office has given us a ton of commentary this week to just think through as we move forward. We're making recommendations because we want to see things change. We want things to be equitable and fair for people in the communities going forward, but we don't want to unleash a possibility that the alternative is worse. Um, I don't know if Natasha and Courtney want to add anything to, or anybody from our group want to add anything to that. But I guess at our 2 week mark this week, we're still up in the air and haven't given a lot of definitive things because This is really the hard part of we know what we see, we know what has been happening, we're getting feedback from people, and what's really come out, and sorry for saying so much, what's really come out is the people who are not in a position to report safely, and give feedback on what they want to see happen. Like there has been a lot of vocal things from us, but these listening sessions, the first listening session really had me sit back and um, just remind myself that there are not millions, but there are thousands of people who are not given a voice. So there are a lot of things that kind of came into play that we may not have thought about in the first 45 days before we started these listening sessions. So I definitely want to encourage people in the community of Richmond to give their feedback, get involved, and talk to us about use of force, because everybody's situation is different. Everybody's experience is different. Um, and the people who are having the hardest times are having the worst experience. What I learned is a lot of them are not coming forward and using their voice because they've never been asked, right? They've never been given the opportunity like this to say what they want to see in their community. So Natasha, Courtney, anybody from our group, feel free to add.
If I could just chime in, and one again, thank you, Sheba, for all that you're doing. I am highly disappointed that members of City Council, whether they wanted to ban them or not, would just not simply have a conversation. I think we really have to look at the historicity of tear gassing. You go back to 1960s, Edmund Pettus Bridge. African Americans were tear gassed. We were tear gassed, and so we also had fire hoses turned on us. We had dogs sicked on us, but we found other options. Right? We no longer have the fire hoses. We no longer see the German shepherds, but we still see the tear gas. And so I think when we begin to talk about use of force and how it's been used on particular demographics within different people groups in our country, I think some sensitivity to that needs to be had. And I believe City Council just simply failed miserably. Even when I tried to get Sheba to speak during public comments, she could have easily spoken during the citizen speaking part versus public comments on the paper, which was simply, it was struck down. And so my greatest concern is our unwillingness to have basic conversations. And the one thing I hear is that, well, hey, we're taking a tool, the alternative. No one's ever sat down to discuss what the viable alternatives are. There are localities that have banned the use of certain non-lethal weapons. And if a non-lethal weapon is still causing bodily harm, as law enforcement, as public safety officials, as mayoral administrations, as legislators, we must find a better way. And it has to happen by basic conversation, basic public dialogue. We need to have a dialogue about this. And I really want to challenge everyone, regardless of where you stand on an issue. What makes America what it is that we are able to have public discourse. And if we can't have it in City Hall, if we can't have it on City Council, and where it's just summarily dismissed and politicked out through the legislative process to where we don't even hear the public input. And people will say, well, the committee, there was public comment in the committee. That's not the same as being before all nine. You're talking about 3 individuals on a committee that had, met sporadically during one of the most turbulent times in the history of our city, dating back to dating back to Civil War, dating back to Jim Crow segregation. We have failed the public, and that has to stop. That cannot be allowed. And the mayor, the administration should be involved in this process. That even though they may support something, we must support first and foremost transparency. People want transparency on a public building, on zoning, and all these other things. What about transparency as it relates to things that impact human lives and just basic human health? And I believe as a council, we failed miserably in that, where we were not willing to have a basic conversation. So I'll just say that, and say that for us to move forward as we reimagine, there is no reimagining without some type of discussion, without some type of courageous conversation. And the use of force, it's on a large continuum that we must be willing to talk about and to support. Because, yeah, what do police officers do then? We have to discuss that. We have to talk about that. We have to have a community conversation as it relates to that, and then find a pathway forward. Thank you.
I also want to add that as the co-chairs have met, I think 3 times this week, we've been having conversations, and it highlights the thoughts about where we're going with these recommendations, not just use of force, but human services, community healing, where we're going with this, who is locked in and committed to this, and how much commitment we're going to get back. We all know that there's a history of bringing together these amazing people and putting in this time commitment. All of us, we put in a lot of time that's not on this 2-hour Zoom call throughout the week. We put in a lot of commitment and emotion and feeling. We want to make sure that there is a commitment from people who make the decisions, not just city council. But we've had the conversations about, and Daryl will probably speak to it further, and Tori, making sure that there's a commitment once we make these recommendations, because these recommendations will be life changing. It is something that is very, very, very necessary and progressive, and we know that change is hard for some people who are comfortable with being in the position of power, but it's time. It's absolutely time for things to change, because we have witnessed, we have been privy to, we have been a part of so many harms for so long, that this right here, this task force, this group, the voices coming from the community, the people who are taking the time and being bold enough to give their input, are asking for and are needing change in our city, because what appears great on paper and policy is not what's happening in our communities. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Sheba. Appreciate those updates from your group. Does anyone have any other questions for the use of force group about their conversations this week?
Yes, I do. I have a couple. I thank you, Sheba, first of all, for sharing. I feel like, especially the latter part of what you shared, is something that I have voiced in previous sessions, and I do feel like it was met with what I felt like was a bit of resistance. So I appreciate at least feeling some sense of sanity in the context that the position that I was expressing isn't one that I'm feeling in an isolated sense. I don't know to what degree you can answer this, and maybe there's strategic reason for not doing so, but can you give us a little bit more specificity in terms of both you and Councilman Jones mentioned some things that I'd like to flesh out a little bit more, if we can be clear about what these alternatives are that we're talking about, that either community members were in favor of, or were willing to support, or were not willing to support, and to the degree in terms of the conversation with council, I guess, for lack of a better term, the unwillingness to have a conversation about it. are we saying that no one, they just didn't want to have a conversation at all in the context of use of force? Or are there very specific things that they did not want to talk about? I wasn't present and I didn't go back, to watch the video or anything like that. So I'm asking genuinely if you can flesh out the specificity of what we're talking about was not favored, both by the community and by our leadership.
If you want me to tackle the first piece of that, the legislation itself just called for the CAO to look at the ban on those things, on particular types of non-lethal militaristic weapons. Wasn't anything that is or would enact law in the area of an ordinance. And basically what the resolution would have spurred is a conversation. Now, by it being stricken, the only time it was up for public comment or any type of public debate was in the Public Safety Committee, which has been since March, April, meeting so sporadically that you can't say that, the public has been on board with it, because they had met during most of the protests. And so the best place for the public to get engaged, in my opinion, is our city council meetings. And so because it was stricken from the agenda, those who had signed up to speak to that paper didn't have an opportunity. And so simply by allowing it back on the agenda, and even if there were still among 5 people that were going to vote it down, all right, great, but at least you would have allowed for the public to come again and share their concerns. And I believe, again, as a legislator, that is something, whether I'm for or against something, I'm always for hearing from the public and how something makes them feel or how it might impact them. And that's what did not happen. And I don't know if that answers your question in totality, but that's my response.
It definitely answers it in part, and I appreciate that. I think I can work through listening to the rest of what Shiva may have to share, or any others, to then lead to my follow-up questions later.
So the alternatives to using non-lethal methods like tear gas, CO2, rubber bullets is using the baton, using more lethal force, and that was striking to me. But I think that in our conversation Tuesday, we were thinking through, like, what happens when there is a large group that aren't breaking the law, that aren't doing things. Are they just people who are casualties of war? Because that's what it ends up being. If there are a small group of people who are doing something that is unlawful, and it's a large crowd, and we're talking about the protesters, where we're not talking about Shako Bottom, where people have been tear gassed for some time when there's a disruption. The police will not go in to take away those few people who are causing this disruption. They will use tear gas and CO2 and rubber bullets. We talked through, like, the long-term effects of tear gas, and Colette says that there is no long-term effects. It's a very short period of time that people are being impacted by tear gas versus going to more lethal methods of engagement. So that, and this is my understanding, that put me at a point where I'm like, is the alternative that we're asking for worse? Or how do we engage a crowd without going to those methods where it impacts hundreds of people who aren't doing the things that are unlawful? Is unlawful assembly considered a threat to life, as the use of force policy says, that's when use of force is necessary? Because we are marching because we are asking for accountability, because we are asking for transparency, because we are saying Black Lives Matter. When people are marching and are not committing an offense that causes a threat to life, are we saying that we are going to use these methods, we are going to use unlawful assembly, we're going to use non-lethal weapons of war to say, shut up, we don't want to hear you, in opposition to asking for police accountability? So I'm at a standstill, and I do welcome like comments from, the other people on the group, because I'm reeling, trying to figure out, where do we go from here? I don't agree with, clearly I don't agree with tear gas in a huge crowd of people. But when we were talking, it just came to light that the alternative is worse. The alternative is harsher. Um, and where do we go from here? Like we have to, work through that.
But I would disagree with that. The alternative is a different style and approach to de-escalation. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not fatalistic and as so many of my colleagues are. The next step is not take away tear gas. Now I've got to, fill you full of lead. That I disagree with that. And we really should take a look at New Orleans and what they did, right? They banned it on particular things and allow it for certain. So if there's a life or death situation, these protests were not, I'm sorry, they were not, from what I saw and what I've read, were not life and death situations. They're not. And so they kind of carved it out. But if we're unwilling to have, again, you're going to hear me say this, we can't even have a conversation about how we move forward and what that looks like. And I challenge any African American who has lineage in this city, in this country. Our grandparents were tear gassed. And so how are we just so willing, so quickly willing to say, okay, it's allowable when it was used on us? And many of these protests are dealing with Black Lives Matter. I know people may have different opinions on that, but again, we have to look for a different pathway forward as it relates to large groups protesting and things of that nature when they are not violent. Vandalism is different than violence. And so how do we go about doing this? And again, all I'm saying is, can we talk?
And for clarity, and I'm not going to take up the whole time. For clarity, the answer that we got was there was, these millions of dollars in property damage. Now, I know that that's an important thing, but like our grandparents say, your life is the most important thing. We're meeting property damage with violence. So to me, just like Councilman Jones is saying, it just doesn't air out. And I'm not saying that I agree that we don't get rid of this. I'm saying that these are the alternatives that we were given as an option. So yeah, and no, property damage does not equate violence and, abuse, in the sense that there's a large crowd and there are a few who are causing the issues. We tear gas the whole crowd. That can't be the alternative, but
Can
Errol?
I say something? This is kind of where I've been with some of this, is that like we're here to make recommendations. We don't have the power to implement and solve every problem, right? I think like what you all are talking about is something that definitely needs to be discussed and figured out, right? Like the task force didn't create this problem, right? These things have been going on for years. So, in my opinion, like, we have 90 days, we're counting down for our final recommendations. Can a recommendation be, because again, even if we had, let's just say we had the magic bullets to, sorry, let's say we had the magic solution to the problem, right? It still would have to go through a process of being implemented, right? I think for me, what I'm hearing from Sheba and Councilman Jones is that, you know, there's not a conversation being had, but this is something that still needs to be looked at. So maybe that needs to be the recommendation, you know. But again, I think it's unfair to feel like you all are going to solve this problem in 90 days. So that's where I will leave that.
Who's our next group?
Apologies about that, everyone. Yes, can we move to the community engagement and healing subgroup for their report out next? But
Yes,
thank you,
hello.
Sheba, and everyone else who reported out. I think we have a lot to continue to talk about in the use of force group next week. So look forward to that.
Yes, hello, this is Birdie. I'm leaving my video off because my internet is still unstable, but it seems like it's holding if I don't put my picture up. I don't know what that says, but anyway. The community healing and engagement group, again, we have had some very hard discussions also as we've tried to dig into our recommendations. And we actually ended up sort of consolidating our recommendations down to 4. And we were trying to put a little meat on those recommendations. Basically, we now have 4 recommendations. The first one is to have community conferencing circles. The second one is to have monthly and quarterly events that are centered around community engagement and healing. The third thing was to implement massive resilience training. And then the fourth thing was to have a center for racial and social justice. And I'll speak a little bit on that one because we also have concerns that the work that we're doing is really important, and we're spending a lot of time and really finding that there are lots of issues that are long-term issues that do need to be addressed. And so we felt like this recommendation would be great because it would actually call for a dedicated office, that the full-time mission of this office and this center would be to iron out these issues, to study these issues, to analyze, and to be a resource, to also implement the recommendations or to look at the things that we as a task force have recommended. And basically we felt that it really is something that could be done, and it just depends on what scale you want to do it, you know, an office that did it or a building or whatever needed to be, I guess, vetted out in reference to what would the city be willing to do and what the budget would call for. So we basically talked about that and what the center would basically be responsible for. And we also just went into some discussions in reference to the theme that we adopted, which is the massive resilience strategy. And we also talked about having a kickoff event as one of the events that would be planned by our subcommittee, and hopefully that the entire task force would help us to bring about. And that would be on November 27th, 2020, joining with Delegate Dolores McQuinn's office to put on a virtual event that would be centered around community engagement and community healing. And on that day, it is referred to as I Am My Brother and Sister's Keeper Day. She implemented she patroned a House Joint Resolution in 2018. And so the Virginia General Assembly has designated the Friday after Thanksgiving of every year to be I Am My Brothers and Sisters Keeper Day. And it's basically a community engagement day where people stop, try to unite, think about the things that we have in common more so than the things we have that are different, and try to do some type of community service, focus on community. So the plan right now is to have a Zoom event. Several people from the subcommittee have agreed to help, so to get this rolling. And it's basically going to be from like 1 to 3 on that day, with a program that would include some keynote speakers, just to bring about awareness and about what we're doing and what massive resilience is. We want to have some type of entertainment, maybe some drums for peace and other music. We're also going to call for a citywide moment of silence, to reflect on the violence and different things, civil unrest and different things that have been going on in the city. And then the third component of that is to challenge people to individually perform some type of community service act or some random act of kindness on that day. And we're going to look to the younger people to get us involved with social media and maybe just have a big, exciting event to kick off some of the stuff that we're doing. I think a lot of it is bringing awareness and enlightenment to people, because a lot of people really do not think about this. They'll watch TV and then they move on to the next thing. But to really be able to understand and to acknowledge the harm that is brought about anytime you have disparate treatment in public safety, and to just sort of talk about the different things that we have going on, and to really dig down and think about and talk about these hard things that need to be discussed. So that's basically in a nutshell what we are doing and what we're working on. We're working very hard to continue to read, and each member of our subcommittee always adds, a bit of enlightenment for us. I have to thank Rom. He provided us with reading materials, and I stayed up half the night last night reading some of that. And we have sweatshirts that he gave us saying we are the work. And so we are really working hard to try to come up with what is going to be hopefully a very, very positive and transformational outcome from this task force.
Thank you, Bertie. That sounds like you guys were incredibly busy this week. Apologies about not being able to join you. I had a migraine this week that got the best of me, but I am very excited about the different opportunities to engage the community and unify the community through the different, policy to programmatic to community engagement and community healing events that you all are talking about. And I think it's really great that you're talking about looking at kind of cross-sectional with local government and state government as well, with partners there. So appreciate all the work that you all are doing. Does anyone else have any comments or questions for the community engagement and healing group?
I mean, I don't know. I'm yielding to Ram only because I didn't know if he had anything to share as a co-chair, but I do want to add my 2 cents, if you will, as a part of the committee, if I can.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. One of the things, so I feel like what a large and in part what Sheba and Councilman Jones kind of brought to light is something that we've been grappling with that hasn't been named. Well, I can't say it hasn't been named, but that I think that is kind of an underlying thing that continues to surface. And it's important for us to understand that a large part of much of what we're attempting to tackle is one, a community, I'm saying very loosely, a community dialogue that hasn't happened. It's not something that we engage in on a regular basis of any kind. And we have to understand that this is a process that needs to be implemented in a way that we can have this ongoing conversation. The problems that we're attempting to deal with based through the lenses that we're addressing on this task force obviously did not happen overnight. And it took hundreds of years, quite literally, to put into place and to solidify in the way that they manifest today. So if we don't recognize the fact that this is an ongoing conversation, and there are going to be things like what Sheba brought up, when there'll be revelations from community members who are not privy to being a part of this conversation in terms of our task force. There'll be, I'll say, for lack of a better term, roadblocks, like perhaps what was encountered in regards to the paper that was put forth before our council. And that's just it. This is we need to then at that point, that's where this whole notion of resilience, if there is any application for it, it's here, where we need to understand that what we're looking at is a process that we're engaged in, or that hopefully we're committed to, that sees through a sense of longevity when we reach these stumbling blocks, or we reach these places where we've got questions unanswered, and we've have the opportunity, if you will, to flesh things out and give it the appropriate time to do so. I stay disturbed by the fact that as we're talking about these things, there are concepts that seem, for whatever reason or another, to either have not been clearly defined, and or there's no collective understanding of, or we're attempting to resolve something with completely different perspectives on what those things actually mean and what they are. We raised the question before about structural racism, and there are still people on this task force who have very different understanding of what structural racism is. And that's problematic for me. I'll continue to say that because, and it's not just about me, it's about the reality that there are things that are very definable, very clearly definable, and it's not left up to our individual experiences and our individual understanding, but we have to understand them from how they're defined at their core in order to be able to resolve them. The same thing, well, yeah, I see. I'm looking at Daryl's comment. And the same thing in regards to what I feel like what Sheba brought up in the context of, okay, we community members were presented with, I'll just say for all other purposes, a set of ideas in terms of where things were headed in terms of the conversations within that particular subcommittee, and received feedback from community members on that, because there were concerns about, well, if we take these things away, well, what are we facing? What are we looking at? And so I feel like it's important, I guess, just to always continue to draw a line or a thread through all of our tasks within these various committees, and the things that don't fit in the boxes of the committee, in order to be able to have these conversations at the depth and at the breadth, I think that are warranted in order for us to be able to flesh them out at a, I guess I would say, in a reasonable way.
Thank you, Ahmad. Anyone else on this, the community engagement and healing group, have any comments or questions? All right, Tori, I'll hand it over to you. And Tori, I know that you were in our first listening session as well. So, you know, along with Sheba, Natasha, and others who were able to join from the co-chairs. I don't know if you want to reflect on some of that as well.
I will.
Thank you.
So we have the Human Service Lens Committee, and our committee came up with 4 solid recommendations. One, we acknowledge that 911 is the number that our community tend to call for everything, because that is the number where they can get a response. But a large percentage of those calls that are received are not criminal in nature. So one of our recommendations is to really begin to look at a different routing system. How do we handle the calls that come into 911 that is not criminal in nature? An example of the type of calls we're talking about, they could be civil matters. Um, a dispute with your neighbor, disorderly kids, some mental calls. So how do we reroute those calls away from the police into a more appropriate um, system where we can have trained professional, or along with the trained professional, community members that might be able to intervene and address some of those issues. We have a subgroup of our group working on really narrowing down and identifying um, what type of calls we would be looking at to kind of reroute or triage into another system. We also need to look at whether or not we want to actually take them totally away from the 911, which is a system that's put in place, or do we want to look at how, when they come into 911, they can then either be routed to the police or to um, another system, and what type of training and resources we would need to do that. So we have a group working on that, and within the next week or two, we should have some solid recommendations of all the types of calls we want to consider um, rerouting away from the police. We also know that because we use the police so often, especially when we're talking about disputes that may involve um, a disobedient child or family relations, and when the police come in and handle it and it's not handled in the way we intended, it can further have impact on the community and police relations. So we really want to get a handle of the calls that come in and is routed to the police. The second thing that is also a very important area that we want to address and make recommendations for is, how do our communities, especially the communities that may have slightly different challenges than others, how do we make sure that they have access to good quality services 24/7 during the times that they need them? We cannot rely on a bankers type hour services when we're dealing with social and human services. So what would that look like? How do we ensure that whomever providing those services to our communities that need them, they are culturally appropriate? There is a process of accountability built into it, not just accountability in the way that we provide the services to our communities, but also accounting for the outcomes that we're looking to receive. And how do we put in place, because during that meeting that Shiva talked about, when we met with a group of community residents, they were very clear that often people come into our communities and bring services that we don't really need, and they don't always provide those services in a way that our residents and families feel respected and leave their dignity intact. And that was a big one. They also wanted to know why, when funders in the city give these organizations that say they're working in their communities monies, why can't the residents be part of the process to look over the grant application so that they are aware exactly what the organizations say they are going to do, and they can help hold them accountable? That was a big part of that conversation with them, was about accountability, who was getting the funding, and how can the residents have a say. As one of the resident, as one of our taxpayer and residents said, is, we're tired of people thinking we need food. There are other things that we need. The other thing that they wanted a process to do is to be inclusive, to really be designed where those smaller, less recognized organizations can really compete for some of those dollars. There are a lot of small organizations that's actually in our communities doing the work that don't have that big name that everybody recognizes, and they're having difficulties receiving funding to do the work that they do. Even though they do not receive the adequate funding, they're still there doing the work. And they would like to be part of that process, and community members would like to see more of those small organizations that they have that relationship with, that are actually in proximity to the communities, understand the norms and value of that community, and know how to provide those services culturally appropriately, and leaving folk with a sense of dignity. Just because I need your help, I don't need you to strip me of everything that I walk into the situation with. The third thing that we want to do is really intentionally begin to prepare our youth um, to be look at some of these careers. Another thing that came out is that a lot of times the folk that are delivering the resources, services, and opportunities in some of our communities are not relatable to the people in that said community. And how do we begin at a very early age, beginning to introduce our young people so that they can begin to feel some of these career paths and opportunities? Um, there was a lot of conversation about what it could look like at a middle school, high school level. What are those intentional efforts that need to happen to begin to open up opportunities for our young people? Um, because we know that just because you have a degree doesn't necessarily qualify you to do the work. And so they talked a lot about the community in terms of relationships with the police. They came up with a really good concept about maybe before we actually hired them as police officers, that they must go through an academy within the community. They must go through and really understand the communities that they work in, who the folk are, what are those value systems, what are those norms, what are the great things that happen in those communities, along with some of their more challenging things. Maybe we should put them through what you call a citizens academy before we actually bring them on as police officers. Um, I think I may have covered everything, but I got lots of team members. Please jump in if I left anything out. Any questions? All right.
Thank you, Tori. I think one thing I would note from that first listening session that stood out a bit to me was really the desire to bring back the community policing approach that seems to have, for whatever reason, kind of shifted. And so I know that there was one person who specifically brought up, foot patrols and how everyone used to be able to know the name of the officers that patrolled their area, and there was a relationship there, and that's changed. And how, how can we bring that back? And that led into part of what Tori mentioned of the community policing led training and academy, that really for trainees who are coming on as police officers as part of the academy, that they get to know community members from the get-go versus later on once they're already released as patrol officers. So really having that community connection from your essentially your first day as a trainee, or even prior to. So I know that was part of the conversation that I thought was really interesting. Tori, and Sheba and Natasha, who were part of that conversation as well.
Yes.
All right, so do folks have any last questions or comments as we continue to move forward? I know that everyone is working really hard and dedicating lots of time to the task force. So again, I just want to say thank you for your work. Really do believe that the work that we're doing is going to be transformational for our communities. And we'll look forward to rolling these various initiatives out. But does anyone have any other questions, comments before we end our meeting for this week and move forward with the initial recommendations next week?
I have two things. I think in an offline conversation, it's ironic that the same thing came up about police engaging with the community and police patrol. And we this week we're talking about communication, like the lack of communication from some officers because maybe they don't reflect the communities that they are patrolling. And in an offline conversation, in another group, somebody from the community said, police will be there. They're present until a crime happens. Like they're maybe sitting in their patrol cars waiting and nobody knows them. So it's difficult to have that balance of what we call community policing if the only time we see them is when there is a crime or something happening. We in the community, and I know a lot of people say, oh, this is all anti-policing. It's not. We are asking for our communities to be served better or served in the same manner that some other communities are serving. We want to know who's patrolling us. It's just like in school or being the parent. Like the mom gets to do all the discipline, the dad gets to come in and say, oh, I'm taking you for ice cream and doing things like that. And the kid automatically is going to say, I don't want to go with dad because he's always, I don't want to go with mom because she's always, putting me on punishment or doing things like that. It has to be one and the same. You can't just come in when there's an issue, when there's a problem, and just not know the community, not know the culture of the community, not know what's going on. And coming from Tori talking about like the Marcus alert, as we're talking about, I know we don't discuss it very much, but that is an opportunity for collaboration. So I think that when we're saying going to another system, it probably has to be a hybrid system. It's especially in the beginning because people are looking at 911 and they're going to have to figure out a better way to just start with community first. So I think it has to be a hybrid system for the safety of our community members who are willing to take on this challenge. And another thing that I wanted to kind of discuss is like our CRB. I think at the city level it is stalled because like Mike Jones said, the Public Safety Committee determines what's addressed, what's not addressed. That's been something that a lot of people have been, asking about, thinking through, and there are certain entities that get to say it's not for discussion. It's not up for discussion right now. So I just want people to be mindful that these are important pieces that the community is asking for that are being set aside, for lack of a better term. So definitely want to um, challenge, like, people to get more involved in asking for what we've been asking for months, what we've been asking for years, that are just kind of being disregarded. And I know in the chat we're talking about refusal to acknowledge. That's another piece that is being refused to be acknowledged when people in the community have been asking for a while. um, and yes, feed into our young people. It's going to have to start at the elementary, middle school level, and it's not all college. I have a degree. I'm not knocking having a degree, but I got my most important and significant learning from being in the community, from having a trade, from being a barber for 11 years. That's what feeds my family when I got a felony conviction that would not allow me to go into traditional census. So we absolutely have to engage our young people and make sure that they are involved in this as well. And I know that some of our young people who came onto this task force kind of fell off because they didn't feel like their voices were being heard. They have to have their own space to give us what they want as well in the community. So that's my, I'm not gonna say anything else today, y'all.
Thank you, Sheba.
Thank you, Sheba. Thank you, everyone. This has been another great meeting. As we've talked about, 90 days certainly is not enough time to address all of the issues that we all care about and are so passionate about. So I know that even after this final report is submitted, that all of us will continue talking to each other and working on the changes that we've recommended together, moving that all forward. So I feel very excited and very hopeful for how this task force work has really come out. And so just want to say thank you again to everyone for your time on a Friday. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.